Hola a todos y bienvenidos. Today you're going to learn all about how to practice speaking in Spanish. We're going to start with a well-known quote. Practice makes permanent. So of course, what we practice ends up becoming an ingrained habit. And so one of the most important questions to consider is, are you practicing good habits or bad habits? Now, in a recent one-on-one Spanish lesson, a student told me that he really wanted to practice his speaking skills. So for the next 30 minutes, the student tried to speak as much as possible in Spanish, and I could barely get in a word. All I was trying to do was keep up by taking notes so I could then give him feedback later. Now, he was telling me a story about working on the subjunctive with another Spanish teacher. Now, the word for subjunctive in Spanish is subjuntivo. Now, at one point, I had to stop him because he kept saying subjunctivo, which is a combination of English and Spanish. Now, instead of sub, we need to say sub, and instead of junk, we need to say hun. So the student practiced this a few times and then went straight back to his story. 1 minute later, subjunctivo. So I stopped him, subjuntivo. He then processed the error and practiced the right pronunciation, and then a few minutes later, subjunctivo again. Now this continued for another 5 or 10 minutes until I had to stop him and explain a few important concepts that I'm going to talk about in this video. And so the first thing you need to understand about speaking practice is that the biggest risk or downside is that if we do it wrong, we can ingrain bad habits. Now the student I was working with may have said subjunctivo dozens of times before our lesson, and as a result, it's going to take him a while to undo that bad habit. Now, there are a few things that we can do to avoid this. And the first step is to understand a little bit about language learning in general. Now, we have to remember that the ultimate goal with language learning is to get as much of our target language into our heads as possible. It's not about speaking a lot or listening a lot. It's about getting the language into our heads. Everything that we do as Spanish students needs to be designed to improve our knowledge of the language. And the way to think about our knowledge of the language is that we have 3 primary skills: the sounds of the language, vocabulary, and grammar. Then we have the sub-skills of language learning, which are reading, writing, listening, and speaking. Now, the primary skills are the things that we build and ultimately represent our knowledge of the language. The secondary skills are things that we can use to test our knowledge of the primary skills, or we can use as tools to improve our primary skills. Now, I have to stress, like any tool, it's possible that we can use it poorly, or we can use it well. And if any of reading, writing, listening, or speaking aren't resulting in improvements in your knowledge of the sounds, vocabulary, or grammar of Spanish, then you need to adjust how you are using that tool. Now, speaking practice specifically comes with some pros and some cons. The pros is that it can build confidence and motivation because it feels really good to be conversing in Spanish. It's also great for gap analysis, and I'll come back to this later. The cons are that it can ingrain bad habits, and it's difficult to do speaking practice well for growth. So speaking does a really good job of testing our pronunciation, vocabulary, and grammar, but it may not improve them if we don't get the conditions right. So how do we get the conditions right for using speaking practice as a tool for improving our knowledge of the primary skills of Spanish? Well, there are 3 components to consider. Number 1, feedback. The most obvious condition based on the story I shared with you earlier is that we need to make sure we are getting good quality feedback on how we are producing the Spanish language. Are there mistakes that we're making regularly, and do we know about them? Now, there are 2 ways that we can get feedback. We can get feedback from other people, maybe other Spanish students that are learning, but it's also possible that they could be making the same mistakes as you, or you could get feedback from Spanish natives or Spanish teachers. Now, with natives, you might often find that they don't want to correct your mistakes, and instead they just want to encourage you. Muy bien, hablas muy bien. They might say this regardless of how many mistakes you are making. And to be honest, teachers can be guilty of this too, because sometimes it's just hard to give negative feedback because you don't want to discourage a student from trying. Now, when I was working with a student I spoke about earlier, I just picked a couple of things from that session, the pronunciation of subjuntivo being one of them. And I let a lot of other mistakes go because it could be too much to focus on in one session. And so apart from that, when it comes to feedback, the most important thing is to find someone that is willing to give you feedback, and then you need to be as open to feedback as you can possibly be. You need to send the message to the other person that you would like feedback and that you're ready for it. In addition, you also need to be comfortable with each other so there can be open communication without judgment, which is about building as much rapport as you can with the other person. Now, the other way to get feedback is to record yourself when you're speaking Spanish. Then later, you can listen back to your own Spanish to see if you can find the mistakes yourself. But Similar to getting feedback from other students, there may be a risk that you don't pick up on your own mistakes. For example, the student that I was working with may not have picked up on the subjunctivo problem while listening back to his own Spanish. Now, in addition to getting good quality feedback, the other side of the equation is to continue to improve your knowledge of the language in other ways so you can then get better at identifying your own mistakes and make less mistakes when you're speaking. But I'll come back to this in a moment. For now, another important condition for growth using speaking practice is number 2, gap analysis. Now, I'm sure you've had the feeling that I want to say something, but I'm not sure of the exact words or phrase, but I can get around it by saying it in a different way. Imagine someone asks you, for example, how was the movie? And you want to say that it wasn't entertaining, but you aren't sure how to say entertaining in Spanish, so you can avoid it by saying it was boring, aburrido, or simply, I don't like it, no me gusta. Now, every time this happens, this is a potential learning moment. And this is what speaking practice is best for, to discover what you don't know so then you can go and fill that gap later. But if you aren't recording the gaps in your knowledge and then filling a gap every time you find one, then speaking practice can be very ineffective at improving your knowledge of the Spanish language. You'll just end up using what you already know and not adding anything new. But we can combat this with the third condition, and that is number 3, planning ahead of time to use new concepts in your speaking practice sessions. Now, it can be really helpful to go into your Spanish interactions with a plan to use something that you are not already comfortable with. Maybe you have a list of new words you've just learned or a grammar rule that you've been struggling with. The key is then to go into your next Spanish conversation with the goal to incorporate that new learning. That way, the result of your speaking practice means that you can now use something in a conversation that you couldn't use before. And if you use a process like this, every time you go to practice your speaking, growth in your knowledge of Spanish and your primary skills can continue to happen. All right, so a couple of practical tips that can help make all of this possible and improve the efficiency of your speaking practice. Number 1, use a notepad. Every time you go to speak Spanish, take paper and pen with you. This is something that I've been doing for years. Then you'll be able to write down feedback for any mistakes that you make, as well as do gap analysis on words, phrases, and grammar rules you didn't know when you tried to use them in a conversation. Number 2, keep lists of new things that you are learning outside of your speaking practice. Whether it's a video on this channel or something on Netflix or a podcast, write down new things with the intention of reviewing them and practicing them later in a conversation. Again, don't just speak a lot. Have a plan and incorporate new words, phrases, and grammar rules as you discover them. Number 3, record yourself where possible so you can then try to analyze or at least benchmark your own skills so you can come back to review your mistakes or track your progress later. Number 4, work on building rapport with the people you're practicing your Spanish with. Show them through your words and actions that you want to be corrected and that improving is really important to you. It can sometimes be good to go back to the same person over and over to practice your Spanish with, as you may already have developed a good rapport with that person. But it might be worth mixing it up with new people, such as a new Spanish teacher, because they might be able to pick up on different things that your normal teacher isn't picking up on. All right, tip number 5, and maybe the most important, balance your speaking practice with other activities. There is a saying that we have 2 ears and 1 mouth because we should be listening twice as much as we are speaking. And it's a common saying for a reason. There is a lot of value in taking in the Spanish language more than we try to produce it. We want to use other sources of practice, such as videos on this channel, Spanish classes, and places where you'll get good quality Spanish input to use as inspiration for your speaking practice later. Remember, the ultimate goal is to improve the knowledge of the Spanish language in your head. Speaking practice done poorly won't do that. But if you can implement the tips in this video, then speaking practice combined with other activities can be a great tool for taking your Spanish to the next level. So what other tips do you have to improve your speaking practice? How else can we turn this activity from something that tests our skills into something that builds our skills? As always, please subscribe if you aren't already, hit the like button, and share this video with someone that is also trying to improve their Spanish speaking skills. Okay, until next time, habla mejor, entiende más.